Nobody noticed the man standing in the rain. He had been there for almost an hour, still, silent, watching the iron gates of Kensington Palace from across the street. His dark coat was soaked through. His eyes never moved. He wasn't a tourist. He wasn't a photographer. He was a royal guard named Thomas Brennan. And he had just overheard something that would change everything. Something he was never supposed to hear. It started on a Tuesday morning. The kind of cold and gray London morning that makes the whole world feel quiet. Thomas had been stationed on the inner corridor of the East Wing, a post he rarely held, one usually assigned to senior staff. But a sudden illness had pulled the regular guard away the night before, and Thomas had been called in last minute. He hadn't thought much of it. He laced up his boots, fixed his uniform, and took his post. For the first 2 hours, nothing happened. Footsteps, distant voices. The soft clinking of a tea tray carried down the hall. Ordinary palace sounds. Thomas stood at attention, eyes forward, the way he had been trained. But then the voices changed. 2 women entered the corridor from the far end. Thomas recognized one of them immediately. The way her posture filled a room before she even spoke. Camilla, the Queen consort. Walking slowly, deliberately. Speaking in a tone so low it almost disappeared into the stone walls. He couldn't see who the second woman was. She wore a gray coat and kept her face turned slightly away. But her voice was sharp, certain, like someone who had rehearsed every word. Thomas kept his eyes forward. That was the rule. See nothing. Hear nothing. Exist like furniture. But some words are impossible to unhear. The boy needs to be managed, the second woman said, before he becomes a problem. Thomas felt something tighten in his chest. He wasn't sure why. Not yet. The timing matters, Camilla replied. Her voice was smooth, careful. It has to look like a natural decision, something the parents agree to, and if they don't, a pause. Long enough to feel like a door closing. Then we make sure they have no choice. Thomas didn't move. He didn't breathe differently. Years of training held his body in place. But inside, something had cracked open. Because he knew exactly who the boy was. Prince George. 8 years old. Heir to the throne after his father. The most protected child in England, and someone was planning something around him. If this story is already, it's pulling you in. You're not alone. Thousands of people couldn't stop watching once they started. Hit subscribe so you don't miss a single part of what happens next. Thomas held his post until the end of his shift. He said nothing to anyone. He signed out quietly, walked through the palace gates, and crossed the street. And then he just stood there, in the rain, thinking he had no proof, no recording, no witness. Just 2 voices in a corridor and words that landed in his gut like stones. He told himself he had misunderstood. That conversations at that level carried meanings he wasn't trained to interpret. That powerful people spoke in codes he didn't have the key for. But one phrase kept. Circling back, make sure they have no choice. He pulled out his phone, stared at it, put it back in his pocket. He looked up at the palace, its windows glowing faint gold through the gray afternoon. And he made a decision. He was going to find out what was being planned, whatever it cost him, because some things matter more than a job, more than a uniform, more than following orders, and a child's future was one of them. **** Thomas didn't sleep that night. He lay on his back in his small flat in Hammersmith, staring at the ceiling, replaying every word. The exact tone, the exact pause. The way Camilla had said natural decision, like the words had been worn smooth from use. By 3 in the morning. He had made a list on the back of an envelope. Names, dates, anything connected to recent changes in Prince George's schedule or security. He'd noticed things in the past few weeks. Small things that hadn't registered as important until now. A shift change that moved George's most trusted protection officer to a different assignment. A new advisor brought into the palace communications team. A quiet restructuring of the schedule for royal engagements involving the whales. Family adjustments framed as routine updates. Alone, each thing meant nothing. Together, they felt like a pattern. Thomas worked the early shift the next morning. He kept his expression neutral, his movements steady. But his eyes were different now. They moved over everything: faces, files left on desks, names on rosters. He was looking for the gray coat woman. He hadn't seen her face clearly, but her voice was still in his head. Sharp, certain, American, maybe, or educated somewhere that flattened the accent. He found his answer by accident. During a brief handover in the East Wing office, scheduling folder was left open on the table. Thomas wasn't meant to look at it. But the name on the top page stopped him cold. Dr. Helena Voss, Senior Advisor. Youth Development and Royal Transition Affairs. A title that sounded like nothing, bureaucratic, forgettable, the kind of title designed not to be remembered. He memorized it and kept walking. That evening, Thomas searched the name from a cafe 2 miles from his flat. Never from home, never from his work phone. Helena Voss had a thin public profile. A few conference appearances. A paper published in a policy journal in 2018. A consultancy firm registered in Switzerland. But buried in an archived news article from 3 years earlier, there was a photograph. A charity gala in Edinburgh. 8 people standing in a row. And there she was, gray dress instead of gray coat. But the same sharp face, the same posture. She was standing next to Camilla. Thomas set down his coffee. His hand wasn't shaking, but it wanted to. This wasn't a misunderstood conversation. This was a relationship, a long one. The kind built on trust and shared purpose. He thought about going to someone inside the palace. A senior officer. Someone with authority and access. But he'd worked inside royal protection long enough to know how quickly loyalty shifted in places like that. Whoever he told could just as easily be part of it. And if word got back that a lower-ranking guard had been asking questions, his career would be finished before morning. His credibility destroyed before he could explain a single thing. He needed something more. Not suspicion. Evidence he paid for his coffee and walked home in the dark. Thinking about Prince William and Princess Catherine. They were the parents. They had the right to know, but approaching them directly, without rank, without proof, without going through the proper channels, was the kind of thing that got people removed from palace life permanently. Still, he kept coming back to George. A boy who didn't know his future was being discussed in quiet corridors by people who spoke about him like a variable in an equation. That thought made something harden inside Thomas. He wasn't going to let this go. Whatever Helena Voss and Camilla were planning, they hadn't counted on one thing. Someone was already watching. Asterisk, asterisk, the opportunity came. 10 days later, Thomas had been quietly watching Dr. Helena Voss's movements, not physically. Not yet, but through the small traces she left inside palace systems he had limited access to. Room booking logs, visitor clearances, catering requests that revealed how many people would be in a meeting and for how long. Voss met with Camilla's personal secretary twice in 1 week. Both meetings were listed under a vague label: Education Policy Review. No minutes. No documentation trail. Just 2 hours blocked out on a Tuesday. And then again on Thursday. Whatever was being decided wasn't being written down. That told Thomas more than anything else. He also found something in the shift records. George's lead protection officer, a veteran named Davies. 12 years with the royal family, completely trusted by William and Catherine, had been quietly scheduled for a reassignment review, not a removal, not a dismissal, just a review. The kind that could go either way depending on who was doing the reviewing. If Davies was moved, George would be assigned someone new, someone unfamiliar, someone whose loyalties hadn't been proven over years of quiet service. The pieces were assembling themselves. On a Wednesday afternoon, Thomas made a decision that could end his career. He requested to swap his post with a colleague, a simple enough ask. Easy to explain as a personal errand, and positioned himself near the corridor outside the East Wing meeting room where Voss and the secretary were scheduled to gather. He couldn't go inside. He had no reason to be there. But the ventilation system in that part of the building was old, and the corridor ran close to the wall of the meeting room. Voices sometimes carried. He stood at attention 6 feet away, art steady on the outside, hammering on the inside. Fragments drifted through the wall. Not full sentences. Broken pieces. The school decision must come from the family. It can't look directed. If he's enrolled there, the access changes. The influence shifts. That's the entire point. William won't agree unless Catherine does, and Catherine won't agree unless she believes it's her idea. Thomas felt the cold move through him. They weren't talking about removing George from public life. They weren't planning something violent or obviously criminal. It was more subtle than that, more sophisticated. They were planning to shape him, to redirect him, to move him slowly, carefully, into an environment where the influences around him would be chosen by people other than his parents. A new school, new advisors, new social circles. A slow, deliberate reshaping of the heir to the throne. And they were going to make William and Catherine believe they chose it themselves. Thomas walked back to his post before the meeting ended. He spent the rest of his shift running through what he'd heard. By the time he signed out, he had made a decision. He needed an ally. One person, inside or connected to the palace world, who he could trust completely. Someone with enough access to help him and enough reason to protect George. He thought of one name. Margaret Hollis, retired, 63 years old. Formerly the longest-serving household staff member in recent royal history, 27 years. Ending with her quiet retirement 4 years ago. She had worked closely with William since he was a teenager. She had known George since the day he came home from hospital. And she had left the palace under circumstances nobody talked about openly. Thomas didn't know the full story. But he knew she had left loyal and left hurt. And he knew she would never let harm come to that boy. He found her number through a former colleague who owed him a favor. He called from a payphone. Old-fashioned, untraceable. She picked up on the third ring. He said simply, "I think someone is trying to take George's future away from him. And I think you're the only person who can help me stop it." There was a long silence on the other end. And then Margaret Hollis said, "Tell me everything." Margaret Hollis lived in a small house in Surrey. 40 minutes from London by train, Thomas took the train 2 days after the phone call. Sitting near the window with nothing in his hands, watching the city give way to green. He'd told no one where he was going. He'd left his work phone at home. She opened the door before he knocked. She must have heard the gate. She was smaller than he'd imagined. White hair, kind eyes. A steadiness in the way she held herself that reminded him of someone who had spent decades being the calmest person in a room full of chaos. She looked at him for a moment, then stepped aside without a word. Inside her home was warm and quiet. Books on every surface. A photograph on the mantelpiece of a young William at what looked like a garden party, laughing at something off camera. She made tea without asking if he wanted any. They sat at the kitchen table and Thomas told her everything. He kept his voice low and his words careful. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't fill in gaps with assumption. He told her only what he had seen, what he had heard, and what he had found. When he finished, Margaret was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Helena Voss." Not a question. Like a name she already knew, Thomas leaned forward. "You've heard of her?" Margaret wrapped both hands around her mug. "She was brought in as a consultant about 5 years ago. Before I left, she had Camilla's ear even then. I didn't like her. Didn't trust the way she talked about the children like they were projects. Assets." A pause. "I raised concerns. They were ignored. Is that why you left?" She didn't answer directly. Just looked at the photograph on the mantelpiece. "I left because I could see the direction things were moving. And I knew I couldn't stop it from the inside." Thomas understood what she wasn't saying. She had tried, she had failed. And she had spent 4 years living with that. He asked the only question that mattered. "Can you get a message to Catherine?" Margaret's eyes came back to him, steady, measuring. "Not directly. Not without it going through channels that Camilla's people monitor. But Catherine has someone close to her. A private secretary. A woman named Claire Ashton. I helped train her when she was very young. She trusts me. Would she listen? If I tell her this is serious, yes. But Thomas." She set down her mug. "This has to be airtight. You walk into Catherine's world with a half-built theory, and you're not just finished. You could make things worse. You could put Davies in the firing line. You could give them reason to move faster." He nodded. He had already thought about that. "I have the scheduling records," he said. "The meeting logs. Voss's connection to Camilla going back years. The pattern around Davies. It's not a full picture, but it's enough to raise questions that can't be dismissed." Margaret studied him. "Why are you doing this? You could walk away. Forget what you heard. No one would ever know." It was a fair question. The most honest answer was also the simplest. "Because I kept thinking about that boy," Thomas said. "Going to a school chosen for him by people who see him as a strategy. Growing up surrounded by influences placed there on purpose, and never knowing any of it." He shook his head. "That's not something I can walk away from." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded. Once, slowly. "Give me 2 days," she said. "I'll contact Claire. But Thomas, from this point on, you say nothing to anyone inside that palace. Not a word. Not a hint." "Can you do that?" He said yes. She walked him to the door. As he stepped onto the path, she called after him softly. "He's a good boy, George is. Curious, gentle, the kind of child who asks questions about everything." Her voice caught, just slightly. "He deserves to grow up as himself, not as someone else's plan." Thomas didn't reply. He just walked to the gate, but he carried her words the whole way home. Asterisk, asterisk. The 2 days felt like 2 weeks. Thomas went to work. He stood at his posts. He smiled at the right moments and said nothing that mattered to anyone. But every time he passed the East Wing corridor, he felt the weight of what was sitting just below the surface of normal palace life. On the 3rd morning, his personal phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. 3 words, "She wants to meet." He read it twice, deleted it. Looked up at the pale winter sky outside the staff entrance. It was happening. Claire Ashton agreed to meet Thomas and Margaret at a neutral location, a hotel lobby in Kensington. Public enough to be safe, quiet enough to talk. She came alone, dressed plainly, looking like anyone having a late lunch. But her eyes were alert and careful in the way eyes get when someone is carrying tension they won't let show. She listened. She asked questions. She asked Thomas to repeat specific details twice, the exact phrasing from the corridor conversation. The dates of the Voss meetings, the scheduling change involving Davies. She wrote nothing down. She simply listened with the focused attention of someone who knew how to hold information carefully. When Thomas finished, Claire looked at Margaret. Something passed between them. the shorthand of two people who had once worked side by side and still trusted each other. "Does Catherine know anything?" Margaret asked quietly. "Nothing," Claire said. "There was a conversation a few weeks ago about a possible school change. Someone mentioned a new institution, framed it as a wonderful opportunity. Catherine didn't warm to it." William was non-committal. It was dropped, seemingly. "But now that you've told me this," she paused, "I wonder if they were testing the ground, seeing how much resistance there would be." "They'll try again," Thomas said. Differently, more carefully. Claire nodded. "Yes, that's how this works." She looked at Thomas with an expression he couldn't fully read. Not suspicion, something closer to sorrow. "You understand what happens next could be complicated," she said. "If I bring this to Catherine, and Catherine confronts the wrong person in the wrong way, it doesn't just unravel the plan, it puts you at risk. Both of you." Thomas said nothing. He had already accepted that. "I need a few days," Claire said. "The timing has to be right. Catherine needs to hear this when she has space to absorb it and respond privately. Not between engagements. Not when she's exhausted." She stood to leave, then stopped. "One more thing," she said, looking at Thomas. "Davies, is he still in post?" "For now. The review is scheduled for the end of the month. Then we don't have long." She picked up her coat. "I'll be in touch through Margaret. Thomas, don't do anything. Don't push. Don't look. Just wait." She walked out through the lobby without looking back. Margaret and Thomas sat in silence for a moment. Around them, ordinary life moved: a waiter collecting cups, two businessmen laughing by the window, someone's phone ringing and being quickly silenced. "Do you trust her?" Thomas asked. "With my life," Margaret said simply. "And more importantly, with his." Thomas looked down at the table. His coffee had gone cold. He hadn't noticed. He thought about George in some classroom right now. Hand raised, asking a question about something he'd seen or read or wondered about. Completely unaware that somewhere across the city, three people he'd never met were trying to make sure his future stayed his own. The days that followed were the longest of Thomas's life. He waited. He worked. He kept his face empty and his movements routine. And then, on a Thursday morning, Claire sent one final message. She knows. She's ready. Thomas stared at those three words for a long time. Everything was about to change. Catherine moved quietly when she decided to act. That was what Thomas would learn later, that she didn't shout, didn't confront, didn't make a scene. She did what she had always done. She was precise, composed, and completely certain. She started with Davies, without explanation. Without announcing her reasoning, she made a direct personal request that his reassignment review be canceled. Not postponed, canceled. She framed it simply as a matter of her family's preference and comfort. In the language of the palace, that was enough. The review disappeared from the scheduling system within 24 hours. Then she made a quiet call to the head of Royal Household Administration. She asked in that steady voice of hers for a full list of consultants currently holding any advisory relationship with the Wales family, directly or indirectly. The request was politely framed. But it wasn't optional. Helena Voss's name, when reviewed, raised questions that couldn't be easily answered. Her consultancy's funding trail was unclear. Her mandate was vague. Her access to certain communications was broader than it should have been for her stated role by the end of the following week. Voss's contract was not renewed. No announcement. No confrontation. She simply ceased to have access. Thomas found out through Margaret, who heard it from Claire. He was standing in his flat when he read the message. He sat down slowly on the edge of the bed and stared at the floor for a long time. It was over, not with a dramatic confrontation, not with headlines. Just a careful, quiet dismantling, the way a skilled person removes a loose thread without pulling the whole fabric apart. He had expected to feel relieved. He did. But there was something else underneath it. Something harder to name. Because no one would ever know. George would never know. William and Catherine would never know Thomas's name. He would go back to standing in corridors and signing in and out of shifts and living his life the same way he had before. Just a guard. Just a man in a uniform. He thought about whether that bothered him. It didn't, really. Because the point was never recognition. The point was the boy. The curious, gentle boy who asked questions about everything. Who deserved to grow up choosing his own path, not walking one that had been quietly built for him by people with their own designs on the crown. Margaret called him a few days later. Claire told me Catherine asked her privately, just once, how she found out. Margaret said. Claire told her she had good people watching. Thomas smiled at that. Just slightly. And Davies? He asked, still in post. Still trusted. George apparently told him last week that he wants to be a pilot when he grows up. A pause, warm and quiet. Davies told him that sounded brilliant. Thomas laughed. It was a short, soft sound, but real. He stood at his post the next morning, the same as always. Uniform pressed, eyes forward. The palace moving around him in its usual rhythms, footsteps and voices, and the soft weight of history pressing down through the stone floors. But something had shifted. Not in the palace. In him, he had learned something that most people never do. That power doesn't always announce itself. That schemes don't always look like schemes. That the most dangerous plans are the ones dressed in calm voices and vague titles in rooms where nothing is ever written down, and he had learned something else. 2. That ordinary people, a guard, a retired housekeeper, a private secretary can stand between a child and the people who would use him. Not with weapons, not with authority, just with attention and courage and the willingness to do something uncomfortable because it was right. He never spoke about it publicly. He never told the story at dinner or whispered it to a colleague or hinted at it in any way. It was enough to know George was safe. George was free. George was, right now, somewhere in a classroom, raising his hand, asking another question about a world that was still fully, completely his own, and a guard stood quietly at his post, in a cold stone corridor, and felt for the first time in weeks at peace.